All right, everybody. Welcome to this month's National Extension Climate Initiative Professional Development webinar. Let's go through some logistics. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube station. Relatively new thing. If you haven't checked it out, Neki now has a YouTube channel, and we'll be posting webinars there going forward. The meeting today is going to have a poll associated with it, very brief poll that will be open immediately upon the conclusion of Keith's talk as we get into the question and answer portion. Did want to mention that you can post questions in the chat at any point in time, and I will moderate those questions towards the end. Also, feel free to raise your hand and we'll take questions verbally as well. This is an extension meeting, so once again, noting that the restrooms and refreshments are where you last left them. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce this month's speaker, Dr. Keith Taylor, Assistant Professor of Cooperative Extension and Community Economic Development, says on his faculty website that he is known as the People's Professor, which I'm intrigued about. So without any further ado, take it away, Keith.
All right. Thanks, Hans. I will bring this up. And I was saying earlier, I got promoted to associate just the other day. So, feeling pretty good about that. All right. So I'll hop right in. In California, on the West Coast, coastal wind is coming. And as a professor of cooperative extension and community economic development, I couldn't be happier about this. For one, I quite literally wrote a book about the community economic development impacts of wind energy development. And this particular area that it's going into, it's just this amazing part of California that not a lot of folks are aware of. Del Norte County, it's adjacent to the Brookings site, as they call it. Amazing natural landscapes, lovely rural area. But as we know, not all of our communities can be rational sometimes. The community came together with a lot of opposition to the coastal wind energy. And a lot of folks had all of these concerns, some of them pretty legitimate and science-based, things like what's it going to do to the marine wildlife? What's it going to do to our fisheries? And then there's other issues that we all know can kind of be bound up in disinformation campaigns. Things like what's it going to do with radiation and all this sort of stuff. So we hosted a community event. We brought in a number of experts and we did some science-based informationals to guide folks and help them understand what the opportunity and the actual challenges were in wind energy development. And we took away quite a bit from that experience. What was interesting to me is really seeing how there's this interface with these big government-driven projects. When they're used with public-private partnerships with investor-owned firms, it can really engender a lot of mistrust, and for a lot of good reasons. So I think that when it comes to extension in our economic development toolbox and in our extension toolbox as a whole, we're missing a number of tools that could really be used to drive a lot of great innovations. And because we're missing these tools, we're lacking the opportunity to drive community governance and to advance community benefit. The good thing is we don't need to start from scratch in any of this. We have a major system that's just under our noses in our stakeholder communities themselves that we can embrace for economic development and tech transfer and extension. Now, a little bit about me, where I come from in this work. I'm first generation all the way through. I'm the first generation in my family to go to community college, undergrad, grad school, get a PhD, do a postdoc, and become a professor. I'm very mission driven in the kind of work that I do. And the reason why is in my hometown, I grew up talking about economic development. Back in the 80s, we had the bagel factory come to town, and we still have the bagel factory being celebrated with Bagel Fest every August of the year. Now, when I got this position in the University of California system as a cooperative extension professor, what I like to say what I do is whereas my colleagues teach in the classroom on campus, I teach in the community. What's fantastic about this is, as a Midwesterner, I get paid to travel all over California and see all the amazing stuff that California is doing. The challenge is when I got hired in 2017, I was quite literally the only person in the cooperative extension system doing economic development. So I was hired in part to stand up a new economic development system as we started hiring more and more folks. And I'm happy to say that over the last couple of years, we've hired a number of other faculty members, and I think that we're at 22 advisors that we've hired that have economic development in their title. So we're in a fantastic place. And relevant to this conversation today, what we're trying to do in our economic development programming is focus on the triple bottom line economics of people, planet, profit. So for today's presentation, I changed the title just a little bit, achieving climate goals and extension, working with the hidden economy and public-private partnerships. It's intended to share a little bit about how I'm thinking about the UC's cooperative extension, doing economic development in the context of advancing the people, planet, profit idea. But it's also thinking about how we look differently with public-private partnerships as well. It's not to say that we reject the traditional approach of how we do public-private partnerships, but to broaden the scope. And I'll share a little bit about the challenges of the way we currently do public-private partnerships. With the agenda today, I want to talk about Extension's climate change challenge and opportunity and the interplay with economic development. I want to talk about the techniques for advancing condition changes in our communities, bringing the best of Extension with kind of climate technology, climate practices, these sort of things. I then want to share a little bit about how I'm thinking we leverage the hidden economy and we institutionalize these condition changes. Too often what happens is that we kind of work with folks at arm's length. We presume that they're going to keep the voluntary agreements, but I think we need something stickier in how we do extension economic development and climate change issues. I'll share a little bit about the use of hybrid institutions, examples of capacity buildings, and conclude with some takeaways and some Q&A with everybody here. So, when we think about how we do economic development, I think the day-to-day, this is what a lot of folks think of. They think of small as beautiful. Economic development is local. It's small and for small towns. It assists the marginalized and maybe even to a fault, right? But in this, we think about the tools that are in our economic development toolbox. A lot of them actually don't comport to this ideal. In fact, the way we do economic development is largely based on kind of four frames: industrial attraction retention, workforce development, arts and culture, and small business development. This kind of top-down approach to economic development comes with trade-offs for community governance and public entrepreneurship. In other words, for our communities to deal with their issues themselves, doing self-help economic development. So many of these companies that we attract to our communities like to make big pledges and big promises in order to get the public's approval of these new initiatives they're trying to drive. For example, Mark Zuckerberg and Meta, they say that they're going to literally do an initiative to cure all diseases. I mean, this is just to bring a server farm to your community. You should allow us to come in, use a bunch of your wholesale power, take up a bunch of space in your community and your industrial development areas. And by, extension, we're going to go out and we're going to cure all these diseases. How cool of a company are we? It's a bit lofty of a pledge from a company that's doing social media, right? Then there's, other projects. I think we all know about the Foxconn project in Wisconsin. Many of these things result in unrecognized pledges. So they claim that they're going to be big bang for the buck projects. They're going to result in wonderful job creation and developing a tax base. But we saw with the Foxconn project in Wisconsin, it never came to fruition, and it soaked up a lot of public dollars. Imagine if instead of giving these dollars to these companies and these fly-by-night ideas, we're actually able to divert it into local initiatives. Also, when it comes to in our economic development toolbox and we think about attraction and retention, we need to consider who we're bringing to town. Some of these communities come to town with little concern for community well-being. I imagine the town of Boca Chica hadn't really thought through that SpaceX would be launching tons of rockets every month, essentially grinding the community to a halt, right? Not every project we bring to town is going to be attractive to us. And a lot of the times it's a distraction, again, from developing local community capacity. And now we're in this new era of big business that can be found in the squabble of kind of new tech and these incumbent Fortune 500 companies that are having at each other. And they want us to play a role in, laying down incentivizing the battlefield. But why do we need to play in these games? We don't need to engage in the fights of these masters of the universe and play second fiddle to someone else's business exploits. And these folks have little concern for our community stakeholders. So these actions are not often aligned with our priorities. So how do we get there, right? I mean, think about this. We've been talking quite a bit over the last, I'd say, 5 to 10 years about a lot of the climate goals. And a lot of these companies have been working with us in our local economic development, have talked about beneficial electrification, moving toward electrified transportation, ending fossil fuels, advancing distributed energy resources, and energy equity. But what's happened in recent years, if you're following the news around AI and crypto and data centers, a lot of this corporate greenwashing has been walked back. Um, so, 2 years ago, we saw a lot of pledges of aggressive carbon targets, but now we're seeing that the energy demands of AI and crypto have made it where these companies that were going for carbon neutrality by 2025 or 2030 have pushed it back to 2040 or 2050. To say we can't rely on these companies alone in order to meet a lot of our climate goals. So when we're reaching into the toolbox for economic development, we keep reaching for these 4 tools, but it turns out we have a ton of tools that are available for us for economic development. This isn't to reject the classic approaches, but to say that we need to diversify what we're doing and how we do economic development. So I strongly believe that extension is the ultimate economic development toolbox. The problem is for extension, I think we're often pretty humble and too beaten back from decades of government austerity, not funding a lot of our extension services. It's made it where we tend to stay with pretty safe terrain where we want to venture out to. So a lot of this is dictated by, federal and state level sort of economic development policies. Now, extension is here to drive important climate innovations by pulling the ivory tower to local communities. We can wrap climate change innovations in vehicles that meet the material needs of our stakeholders and use effective science-backed communications, as well as leverage existing business models embedded in what I call the hidden economy. And I will talk a little bit more about what the hidden economy entails. Now, something that vexes a lot of folks that are working in this space with the environment and climate change is what changes minds and behaviors. It's reasoning, is it democratic participatory mechanisms? These things definitely do have a place in how we drive change. But there's certain new books that are really questioning this folk theory of democracy. One, Democracy for Realists, I highly recommend, drew a sharp attention. They asked, in our history in the United States, where do we see a mass change of the populace toward new political ideals, new desires, and whatnot? And one of the things you'll hear about often is people point to the Gingrich Revolution in the 90s as one era that changed a lot of our politics, or they'll point to Obama. But what we do know is the data shows that that's not actually what happened. It was a turnout game. The only time in American history, according to Atchin and Bartels, that we saw a change is during the FDR administration with the New Deal era. And a lot of that had to do with enhancing the material quality of life for everyday people. That's what got people to change a lot of their political orientations and to be more willing to try new things. So what we need is we need a more holistic approach to how we go about instigating condition change. Along with that, too, we need to think about how we institutionalize it. If we talk to our colleagues that are in economics, a lot of the times they'd say, of course, it makes sense that if you bait people with a material gain in their life, it's going to change their behavior. But what happens is our economics colleagues tend to stop there. They'll say things like, oh, Amazon. Amazon has been really good for the consumer, and that's all we really need in order to enhance the quality of life. But at the end of the day, Amazon only cares about the shareholder. So the reason why Amazon is passing on good value to the consumer is to get that throughput, that revenue stream that they can then profit off of and send it back to their shareholder. That's not durable for us wanting to cause new policy changes, instigate and initiate condition change with climate and all these sort of things. Instead, we need to be working with institutions that fit. An example I'll give is one of my favorite businesses is Pachamama Coffee Co-op. It's headquartered out of Sacramento. Uh, so Pachamama Coffee Co-op, and it's is a cooperative that's owned by 5 national co-op systems. Uh, Pachamama serves pricey coffee just like Starbucks, but at the same price point. So why does that matter? Well, what Pachamama will go out and market itself on is you're going to pay the same price for Starbucks, but you're going to get better quality and taste, and you're going to get economic empowerment to the farmers, and you're going to be driving an ecologically sustainable product. All of their products are organic. So essentially, what they're saying to their consumer is, if you're going to go spend $5 on a cup of coffee at Starbucks, why not come over to us and spend $5 at Pachamama, where it's going to have all of these socio-ecological impacts? To me, that's a really good hook. And it's it's a way to demonstrate what kind of institutions could fit within this frame of how we can drive better condition change. Now, just briefly too, kind of going back, thinking about other venues beyond just using institutions, we definitely want to be better about our communication skills. So I definitely recommend these books for sure. It definitely helps us communicate better with our stakeholders. You're Not Listening, Getting to the Heart of Science Communication by Faith Kearns, and Participatory Practice by Margaret Ledwith. Fantastic books, and I highly recommend them. Now, when I think about what Extension's role is in our communities, we're here to be a trusted resource in order to enhance the overall quality of life of folks in our communities. And that's by bringing this tech transfer from our universities to our communities and our stakeholders. So how best do we leverage our public dollars and resources to create empowering jobs and equity, durable, resilient institutions, complement public goods, cultivate public entrepreneurs, and diversify and grow economic democracy? Here's the glitch. And going back to the example of coastal wind energy, the credibility of our wind energy development partners is indeed suspect when they're receiving enormous government subsidies and they're owned by shareholders, right? Furthermore, the community benefits agreements can then feel like they're refunneling public dollars as a payoff. And then trust is harmed when these companies are not forthcoming about the full scope of benefits they're willing to offer their local communities. Now, I think that limiting our community economic development contributes to elements of our civic decline. The book Bowling Alone really covered a lot of the challenges that we're facing in the United States, but this goes back to the 90s. So we're talking 30 years ago, essentially. Robert Putnam saw this on the horizon, that we have a real civics and decline problem in the United States. And when it came to the 2012 election with Obama and Romney, you could see some of these tendencies. We heard about job creators, we heard about workforce, but absent from the conversation in that election cycle was community, citizenship, democracy, entrepreneurship. We need to re-engage with those things in order to strengthen our communities. So I think about the work of Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs discussed this alienation that was going on in these urban enclaves, and was observing where there were really positive developments through parts of Canada and the United States. And one of the things that she promoted was this idea of import substitution. Instead of relying on external absentee firms to provide for economic development, go local as much as you can. And that's great. But to get there, we need to have small and hybrid business support systems in order to make sure that these companies can compete against the big guys, right? And so how is it that we go beyond these kind of one and done projects? Now, that said, we also can't dismiss the abundance of entrepreneurship that goes on within our local communities and the ability of local folks to come together to overcome a lot of their challenges. This is a great quote from Nobelist Eleanor Ostrom. There's no reason to believe that bureaucrats and politicians, no matter how well-meaning, are better at solving problems than the people on the spot who have the strongest incentive to get the solution right. This is kind of a call to say we should stop relying on bringing in big business to our local communities alone and diversify that toolbox. We in Extension should help stand up these ecosystems that can empower our local folks to take control of their local economic future, What this means is going beyond just the idea of states and markets, right? Instead of relying on just the government or just big business, we need to look at other alternatives that are out there in order to drive tech innovations, economic development, all these sort of things. Now, in my mind, what this means is we need greater literacy in institutional forums. So instead of just, again, looking at the government or just big business, what about things like nonprofits? What about things like cooperatives? What about ESOPs? These are all really interesting kinds of firms that, when used properly, have enormous economic impact. And this also enhances local stakeholder capacity for public entrepreneurship. Within this, I think about these kinds of firms. I call them hybrid firms. They have features that are like the government, but they also have features like business. So they have these market-like features and these government-type features, but they have a lot of controls that are held at the local level, meaning that the wealth that's generated is then rooted locally, and it helps to incentivize folks to want to get involved in entrepreneurship and want to drive local changes. They help to meet local common material needs as opposed to one slice of the economy, which would be the investor class. These multi-stakeholder features of hybrids are community-facing. They're porous. They can scale. So what this means is that these economic systems can go national and allow someone that's in rural Montana to go to a state association, a national association, and have voice at multiple levels in our governance and our government. And the great thing is there's actually a lot of these firms that currently exist in our local communities that are big, easy wins on public-private partnerships that we should be engaging with. Now, already there's a number of groups that are out there that are playing in this space, and this is just a sample. These are some of the folks that I play with along the way. But it's to say that we don't have to do this alone. We don't have to do this from scratch. We have a lot of groups that are already thinking about these things. And we in Extension would be well served to engage with them. Now, as mentioned earlier, there's numerous types of firms that exist in this space in the hidden economy. I see this as a vast ocean of potential public entrepreneurship. And this is from the Democracy Collaborative. It's sort of the spectrum of ownership that's out there for these kinds of firms. Now, one kind of firm that I want to share that I think is really amazing is in California, we have this Rural County Representatives of California. It's a joint powers authority. Essentially, they take 40 of California's rural communities. They form a quasi-government entity, Rural Counties of California, Rural County Representatives of California, RCRC. And through them, they pool the purchasing power of these counties to create other joint powers authorities as subsidiaries. So you see here on the right-hand side of the screen, they've created these other groups that deal with housing, that deal with wood products and bio-based products. And one that I'm really excited about is broadband, the Golden State Connect Authority. What they do is they basically say, hey, whatever communities out here in the state want to have a municipal broadband system, come to us. We will aggregate the purchasing power and all the technical expertise you need, and we will help you stand up a local municipal broadband system. Currently, they're working with 27 communities on doing just this right now. So this is one example of how you can use a joint powers authority or a quasi-government organization in order to drive condition changes, economic development, all these great things. Now, the area that I'm really excited about that I'd love to explore is the cooperative sector. Globally, cooperatives are huge. They comprise a big part of the economy. 1 billion people served, 150 countries, 100 million jobs. Now you think, that's great, but what about the United States? It's the belly of the beast of capitalism. Surely we don't have this cooperative economy, right? But it turns out you'd be wrong. The US actually has the biggest cooperative economy in the world, significant in agriculture, in finance, in housing, and energy, which I'll touch on briefly. But I'm sure many of you are members of co-ops, whether it's food co-ops, credit unions, REI, your local agriculture co-op. Co-ops are everywhere and they're in our backyards. Now, this is an outdated number here, but the cooperative system is roughly 3 trillion in value. I think the most recent elements in the United States is that it's more like 5 to 6 trillion. And cooperatives are predicated on these 7 cooperative principles and values. Shorter of this is they're designed for community benefit and economic sustainability. They're not there to extract from the community, but to create more value. Here's another map. This is from the University of Wisconsin Center for Cooperatives. Again, this is an undercount, but it's to show you where cooperatives are around the United States. They're literally everywhere. And I'm sure many of you know these brands. When you think about what we do in extension and the kinds of technology we've developed and the kinds of products, the kinds of innovations, these companies could be fantastic public-private partners for us. Now, one of the things I can hear from folks is that a lot of times when they're exposed to cooperatives, they know about food cooperatives or worker cooperatives, and they'll talk about how they're not really that big of a sector. And that's true. It's something that I want to see more of. I want to see them scale up because the benefit they provide is enormous. Here's an infographic that the Association for the Food Cooperatives created. You can see compared to a conventional grocery store, food cooperatives have a pretty big economic impact. They help out with our local agriculture, and they also have a wonderful environmental impact as well. So this is just one example of one particular sector. Now, who benefits from cooperatives? Sometimes folks will think that a cooperative can only be owned by the consumers, the workers, but it turns out cooperatives can be owned by numerous stakeholder classes. So it could be consumers and citizens, small businesses, manufacturers and vendors, other kinds of hybrid firms, and even governments. There are school systems that have purchasing cooperatives that pool together in order to get better deals on desks and these sort of things. And the mechanisms for benefit is that this allows us to aggregate that kind of local and doing a process, what I call scaling local, in order to achieve market power, political power, and reverse extraction or value creation. So this now leads me to think about how it is we can leverage these kinds of hybrid institutions to drive capacity within extension. When I think about the cool projects that I've seen, one of the critiques that I have is that there's too many ones and dones. So, there's this project that's in Sebastopol, California. It's called the Barlow. It's really neat, but it's a one and done. They don't have a strategy for building more of these things, these kind of community downtown incubators. We need more of these. We need to figure out how we can scale them. Uh, Public entrepreneurship in the United States is kind of the forgotten art form. And it's time to create a repository for starting up and scaling these hybrid enterprise and how we do public entrepreneurship in the United States. The great thing is, as I'm alluding to, we have latent community capacity right now. We don't have to start some things from scratch. We can engage with a lot of these institutions. If there's those of you in the audience that are, Lord of the Rings nerds, there's the Steward of Gondor. He sat on the throne doing nothing for years. I think that's what's happening in many of these cooperatives. And we need to engage with the leadership of these cooperatives in order to get them to remember what their community charge is. What I want to share today, though, is some of the things I've learned from the electric purchasing and credit union co-ops, sort of startup techniques, how they maximize material benefits and leverage associations for scale. So we're going to go through this pretty quick because I want to get to the Q&A and dialogue. So in terms of public entrepreneurship, there's sort of three things I've observed, like how it is. Well, on one hand, I'm talking about how we can engage with existing co-op structures. Engaging with them helps inform us how we can start new ones that we need for our communities. So I'm going to give three examples. One is the impact investor example, the veterinary co-op. Two is the philanthropic model that started the credit union sector. And three is the government support that stood up the electric cooperatives who are now independent and operate on their own. Though they do get some government support, just not as much as one might think. So the impact investor side of public entrepreneurship, I have the good pleasure of getting to know the purchasing cooperative sector, but specifically the veterinary cooperative. It turns out that a lot of small businesses that thrive in our local communities, you sort of ask, how the heck can that business stay afloat when there's these big competitors like Amazon out there? Well, it turns out there's this massive purchasing cooperative sector, and a lot of these brands you probably recognize you didn't know were purchasing cooperatives. So Do It Best, Ace Hardware, Carpet One, these sort of brands. In fact, the supply side, the supply chain side of KFC is actually a purchasing cooperative. The branding side is investor owned, though. So I have this infographic that I developed with the CEO and founder of the veterinary co-op. This was founded, I think it was in 2011. He saw an opportunity to help out the independent veterinary clinics. At the time, Banfield was growing, and it was buying up and rolling up a lot of the independent clinics. So independent veterinary clinics were underperforming, And he saw an opportunity by creating an association. They could aggregate the purchasing power and create a bunch of technical support systems in order to help out the veterinary clinics in order to compete. So in 2011, he went from 4 clinics that were members to today, where they have 4,400 members of the veterinary co-op. Collectively, they have $1.5 billion in pass-through. They have 14% of the veterinary market. They're a major force, and it only took them under 10 years in order to get there. But this shows you that these small businesses can punch above their weight, and they can do much better when they work together. These purchasing cooperatives serve as a central point where those of us in extension can go to work on tech transfer opportunities. And we can talk more about that in a little bit. The other thing too is that these purchasing co-ops do get together every year. It's at what's called the Accelerate Executive Summit. It turns out this year they're going to be in California, well, in 2025. So I'm looking forward to working with them on trying to develop a small business support system in California around the purchasing cooperative model. So to say, one of the great things about this is there's ways to access these systems. They're really big bang for the buck for those of us that are resource constrained. I like to call the philanthropy that built the credit union sector the superhero origin story. I think when people talk about philanthropy has gotten a bad rap in recent years. There's some books that have come out criticizing the motives behind these philanthropists. So Gates and Zuckerberg and whatnot. And a lot of it's because they're just trying to bring their pet projects out. That's the critique, at least. And a lot of the things they're doing are more dependency generating as opposed to building new systems that are owned and controlled by the stakeholders they're assisting. And believe it or not, that's actually how the credit union sector was founded. In the early 1900s, Edward Filene, he was a retail industrialist. He was tired of the loan sharks taking advantage of his members. He got exposed to the German banking co-op model. He brought it to the United States, and mixing the thrift movements of credit with the labor union movement, he created what's called the credit union. He put $1 million of his own money into what was called the Credit Union National Extension Bureau. And they went out, they provided technical support services, and they stood up credit unions all over the United States. You can see this chart here, just how fast these credit unions grew. And I'll tell you, that 51,000 should be over the 1954. It turns out a lot of these credit unions have merged. So 1908, we started out with just a handful of credit unions. 1921, we had almost 200. By 1937, we had 6,400 credit unions. And by 1954, we had 50,000 credit unions, all from his $1 million investment in philanthropy. Absolutely remarkable story. And you think about that, how it is that in university systems, we can engage with our philanthropists to stand these up. It's a real opportunity. Now, the area that I focus a lot on in my own work is the American electric co-op sector. For those of you that aren't aware, the electric cooperatives were founded because in the 1930s, in the midst of the New Deal, you only had a small amount of the rural countryside that was electrified. It was 10%. FDR had reached out to the investor-owned companies and offered a ton of subsidies to them in order to go into the rural countryside. What happened is they rejected those subsidies. They didn't want to go there, not because it was unprofitable, but because it wasn't profitable enough. So the federal government set up a system where they provided the low interest loans and the technical assistance to stand up these electric co-ops with the local farmers and rural folks. This is an actual picture of a barn raising of an electric co-op in a rural area in the United States. Through these government dollars, which, by the way, were paid back to the federal government with a profit, we created what's today the American electric co-op system. So 56% of the American landmass is represented by energy democracy, which I think is a remarkable story we don't talk enough about. If you look at where a lot of folks in this room are, electric co-op often overlaps with an area you represent. These electric co-ops, there's 820 plus of them, representing 42 million Americans, generating over $40 billion a year in revenue. And what's amazing about the electric co-op system is it's its own political economy. There's over 8,000 board members in the United States. So if you go to a national conference of the electric co-ops, it's enormous. It's something that you really need to go to. In terms of the economic impact too, it's huge. 71,000 jobs, some of the best jobs in these rural communities, $183 billion in assets. They invest a ton of money in local economic development. In fact, many of these electric co-ops have economic development divisions, and they're wanting to collaborate with Extension. So these are great opportunities for public-private partnerships. You can see that they really are thinking about the service that they're providing to their local communities. They want to keep the cost contained. I can tell you that's in direct juxtaposition to what I'm dealing with, where our investor-owned utility in my parts is paying off a bankruptcy. And during this heat wave we've had in California, energy bills have been more than double for many folks. This time last year, I think my energy bill was $80. This year, it was $150. You would not see this with electric cooperatives. And the amazing thing is these electric cooperatives are some of the foremost utilities that are helping out with the energy transition from carbon intensive to renewable and carbon free. They're doing just absolutely remarkable things in this space. And the part that I'm also excited about is their movement into broadband. A lot of us are tasked with helping stand up local broadband systems, so we don't even know where to start. But these electric cooperatives are open books. I've been working intimately with Anza Electric Cooperative on trying to understand how it was they stood up their broadband system. They're in some of the most rugged rural terrain in California, and they have broadband speeds that are basically like Seoul, South Korea, and they're doing it at $80 a month. Now, here soon, we're going to have a government investment come through those parts, and it's going to increase the speed in rural Anza, and it's going to lower the broadband cost. It's just an absolutely amazing story. Now, in terms of folks that might be interested, I'm working with my colleagues out of University of Minnesota. We're developing the Electric Cooperative Innovation Center, and the purpose of this is to expand energy extension and utilities extension. There's definitely an opportunity to collaborate with the electric cooperatives, and they're very interested in driving energy equity, broadband equity, all these sort of things in these rural communities. So we're coming up here on the end. What I want to close out with is, whoever said anything about starting from scratch and how we go about this. As I hope I'm demonstrated, there's this amazing system that's just under our nose. It's waiting for us to utilize. And these folks are values aligned and they're mission driven, like Extension. So the takeaways I have from this, the first thing I want to say is I know that sometimes people joke around and say I'm co-op Keith, like Keith, you love co-ops and you think they're the greatest thing in the world. I'll tell you, co-ops don't always apply to all situations. I myself use Apple products. I can't imagine a co-op being as innovative as Apple, but I can imagine a co-op being pretty innovative with food and agriculture, doing all those sort of things. So we need to always question the appropriate institution that's applied to certain problems and challenges. But I do think that at the same time, we should always favor local. We should think about how it is we can help our local communities out, create local ownership, have local enterprise, but also make it where they can scale and compete against the big guys nationally. I also think we really need to work on systematizing public entrepreneurship, and we can do that. We have a lot of institutional capacity in the extension system and elsewhere. We have our USDA regional rural development centers that we can funnel a lot of this information through. We have a ton of corporate forms also that we could play with that could help create sustainable business models to get this research out there, this research practice, whatnot. We also have innovative financing that exists. I'd recommend folks pick up the book, The Public Wealth of Cities. That's a fantastic book. But again, going back, we have the credit unions are out there that can help us stand up a lot of these systems. There's also another group I'd recommend folks look into, the Impact Finance Center out of Colorado. They're doing wonderful things helping out communities leverage scarce capital in order to develop community-based projects. The other thing too, in working in public-private partnerships, there's a lot of folks that can be pretty cynical and they want to point out the negative of what's wrong in these systems or why it is they haven't worked in the past. Myself, I'm looking for solutions. And I think the more that we focus on the negative, the more we spin our wheels and we don't get anywhere. Instead, the more that we do an appreciative approach where we're looking at those things that have worked, we get more ideas and more creativity to leverage to build out these systems and enhance our capacity. I also think that extension could be this feeder for enhancing the hidden economy. And the hidden economy can also help out a great deal with extension. So to me, the hidden economy is this amazing place where we can get a lot of tech and social science transfer. At UC Davis, we have a lot of amazing ag tech that's coming out, and we can't get it to market because we're trying to market it through traditional investor-owned firms. And these investor-owned firms are backed by venture capital that want a 12 to 15% return. You're not going to get that in agriculture. This is where something like a cooperative or an association is ideal. The other thing is we have these amazing economic development entities all around our states. A lot of them are looking for new ideas. So we need to engage with them as well. The other aspect too, when we talk about playing with the hidden economy, obviously in extension, we do a lot with youth development. I think of 4-H. The electric co-ops have this thing called Youth Tour. Youth Tour would be an amazing complement to 4-H. Agriculture also has their own youth development in the co-op space. And the credit union has this young leaders aspect. Furthermore, I don't know a whole ton about it, but there's a lot out of Italy where they're actually they're leveraging cooperatives to deliver social services, and these social cooperatives are really impactful. I think when we're talking about we're waiting for policy, we're waiting for other people to come to our communities. We don't actually need to wait. We are the ones we've been waiting for in this. We just need to move beyond just thinking strictly about just the market or just the state solutions and move into the space of public entrepreneurship. So in terms of resources, there's a ton of things that are out there. Obviously, this is a space I work pretty intimately in. If y'all have any thoughts or questions, and feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to share connections in your space. And from there, open to question and answer discussion. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Keith. We've got a couple in the chat. The first one was from the middle of the talk asking where RCRC gets its capital.
RCRC does have member dues from its county members, but they're also able, through their joint powers authority, to go out and do bond offerings. So when it comes to investing and standing up new enterprise, they're able to do that through just your normal kind of government revenue seeking behavior. With that, they've also developed other business support services they've also served as other revenue streams. They've gotten into mortgage lending. I don't exactly know how that occurred, but their mortgage side, I think it's capitalized at something like $3 billion. So they're a serious association doing pretty remarkable things. I'm currently writing a piece about RCRC, so that's something that I will look into more for that piece and targeting for Journal of Extension.
Oh, great. Okay. The poll is open, so if you would fill out those 2 questions, we'd appreciate it. And then the next question comes from Mark. Where do B Corps fit in your mix of options?
B Corps are absolutely there. I think they're fantastic. I think you still need to be wary of who the end owner is. So if the shareholder ownership is all external and absentee, even though they have that B Corp to blunt some of the harsher elements of capitalism, shall we say, at the end of the day, they're there to drive profits back to their shareholders. So I'd say they're better to work with than a strict investor-owned firm, but there's still some challenges.
All right. Feel free to post more questions in the chat or raise your hand and we'll call on you. I did have a question as you were speaking that I wanted to run by you. As you look at entrepreneurship and building communities, do you feel that the approach for fostering entrepreneurship has to be somewhat different between rural communities or urban communities?
I definitely do. Since coming out to California, I came out here in 2017. I did my postdoc in Bloomington, Indiana, at IU. What shocked me is how quickly me, like a country bumpkin kind of guy, was able to get connected to people in venture capital, people that were executives in major corporations. And what I call it is like the density of opportunity in the Bay Area is just enormous. And I can't believe the access to folks I'm able to get with my title and proximity. Rural California, here it is. It's closer than a lot of you folks are to the Bay Area, but they feel just as isolated as a rural place in West Virginia. Um, so we definitely do need different strategies. And that's where I think something like RCRC could be a major feeder to help out public entrepreneurship. We need to have this convening space for entrepreneurs to go to figure out where to get money, where to get business strategy, where to connect with franchises and purchasing cooperatives. Those don't really exist as robustly as they should. And I think that the resources are actually there. It's just that we haven't created those feeder mechanisms yet. So the answer to your question is, yeah, it's going to be different. Um, but once they get stood up, I think that a lot of our rural support systems in such a scenario could be ported over to urban support systems as well. And we can get a lot of co-benefits from that relationship.
Excellent, thank you. Let's see. Dennis managed to post in the chat before David raised his hand, so we'll go with Dennis first. He's asking to say more about the potential of electric cooperatives to lead the way to a clean energy future. A largely unmet potential, in his opinion. Why is that?
Um, so I'll say that all electric utilities are having the same problem, which is that the old business model is that you would take out loans on your infrastructure for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So trying to offboard all of those assets is a real big pain for everybody. So that's one. It's just the basic business fundamentals of utilities and how they're changing. That then opens up a lot of doors for new entrants who can operate with new business fundamentals, of course. Um, but in terms of what the electric co-ops can allow, I use that term porousness. An electric co-op, if I have a problem with PG&E in California and I want to express my dissatisfaction or participate, I call customer service. They're going to direct me somewhere else. They're never going to let me talk to the board. They're never going to let me talk to the CEO. They're going to direct me to the Public Utility Commission. When I did my book, I talked to the CEO of Verendry Electric Co-op and I said, how can people get involved? He's like, I got to be careful I don't piss anyone off. They can find me at the church and they can yell at me, you know? And that's the fundamental difference. The porousness of the system is such where you can access key leadership and get involved. Now, this means some electric co-ops are going to be more forward thinking and involvement and others are not, for sure. And in those instances where they're not engaged, you have to put pressure on the board and the CEO. In those instances where they are open, you can get involved. You can either run for the board, you can be on the advisory committee, you can get involved in business development opportunities for like community solar and these sort of things. I want to say some like 300 or 400 electric co-ops have community solar programs. And they just don't brag about themselves a lot. It's really unfortunate. Um, so we don't know what we don't know that's out there in this space. But I can tell you, in my experience, a lot of them are going into renewable energy, and a lot of them care about the community benefits that come with that. So Dennis, if you have more follow-ups, and by all means, drop them in there.
All right, I'm going to shut the poll down in about 30 seconds. And in the meantime, David, please let us know your thoughts.
Sure. Thank you, Keith. Well, one of the things that struck me was the narrative about how you were hired in 2017. That's the only person, and now you have 22 people with economic development in your title, if I remember correctly. Do you have any sense about how that happened, how that growth happened, and why? What drove that?
So I think it's a lot of really happy circumstances that occurred along the way. Our leadership had targeted economic development as a big area for us to go into in California. So that's part of why I got hired. And they were hedging that they could actually get the state to increase our budget. And those of you that know how that works, to say that the state's going to increase your extension budget kind of makes you laugh, right? Turns out that during the pandemic, California did very well on the balance sheet. We had one year where budget surplus was, I think it was like $90 billion. And we got a doubling of the state budget for extension. And so I think it was a happenstance thing, along with a lot of aggressive grit from our leadership that have been pushing that for years. But with that, we're now in a deficit time. And somehow, luckily, we've been protected from any kind of clawbacks from those increases. So it looks like that money is locked in. As you all know, though, if you get an increase in extension, that increase is probably the only increase you're getting for the next 20 years. So, let's celebrate that right now and build what we can, but can't count on another budget increase like that for a long time.
Thank you.
All right.
Maybe I
Wendy,
could
you're
follow
next.
up.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So I've heard you use somewhat interchangeably the terminology of community economic development, community development. Do you use those different terms strategically or consciously, or is it just kind of what happens to come to mind?
It's funny, David, like that's actually something I've been working on in my own presentations, is being clear about that. When I deal with the California Association of Local Economic Development, I'm just saying economic development for sure. But when I talk to a crowd like this, I definitely mean a CED, community economic development, in a broader term, a broader umbrella. I don't think that they're separable. A lot of folks say community development is things like housing and social services, and then economic development is those four main toolbox ideas, right? I think that they're all the same thing and they should be grouped together. I don't know that I've really seen a big debate around that, but that's something that I think about, and over the years, I want to write more about for sure.
Okay. Now we'll go to Wendy, who has her hand up.
Thanks, Keith. You gave a great presentation. It occurred to me that I wanted to ask about, are you training extension educators to involve co-ops in their programming? And if so, are they doing climate education projects that you see an increase in this involvement with co-op partnerships?
So the short answer is I want to, not doing it yet. A lot of it's because a lot of the folks that we've hired, they're about a year and a half into it. And any extension system is just going to take you a while to get used to it. And the UC system especially is going to take time. We're meeting, the cohort of us are all getting together in October with leadership, and we're going to be pushing this, let's be on message with triple bottom line economic development. So that's definitely an institutional priority. The aspect of hybrids and co-ops and this sort of thing, that's going to be up to each individual advisor to choose if they want to use it. But I can tell you, because a lot of these folks are fresh out of grad school, they're very excited about the opportunity to engage with that. So this particular cohort, I would say it's very much an under 50 kind of cohort. It is a cohort that's very mission driven, and they're very excited about these concepts. And kind of one of our strategies has been, why do what a lot of the other extension systems have already done for us? They've already built out a lot of great programs for workforce and attraction retention. We can go grab that off the shelf. Let's be the niche players that build out this other stuff. And that's what we're going to be talking about in October. Is what does that look like?
Good advice. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy.
All right, we'll do one more question and then we'll sign off for the day. Alex has got it in the chat. Alex says, say more about the structure of solar co-ops. Are those structured separately from existing electric co-ops? And how can extension contribute to adding renewable energy to local communities?
Yeah. So let's see. Within the electric cooperatives themselves, there are some of them that have spun off co-ops of co-ops, where they collectively own a separate legal entity, and they do that on purpose. They can pool the purchasing power. Maybe one co-op doesn't have land that's good for developing a solar project, but another one does, and they can have ownership in that and then purchase the power to bring it back to their local community. So that's one model. A lot of co-ops are building solar within their systems, and some of them will kind of create a carve out for community solar that will allow renters and whatnot to play in that space so they can benefit from the profits generated off that directly. So that's another model. And there's another one they think about that doesn't play directly with the electric co-ops. It's called Namaste Solar Co-op. It's a national worker cooperative that I believe is focused on more on installing. I don't think they manage the assets once it's built. But that would be another example of the solar side. Let's see. What was the other question on that one, Hans?
How can extension contribute to adding renewable energy to local communities?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example of something we're kicking around right now. And none of this is proprietary. We're seeing where it goes. We have Anza Electric Co-op. They bought 150 acres of land, and they're wanting to do some agricultural work. We're like, why are they doing that? Well, it turns out they're a USDA food distribution hub for people in poverty in their area. We're like, oh, well, maybe we could do a cool local farm project with the high school, and they could, grow more food. Here at UC Davis, we've got a colleague that's working in agrovoltaics. So the solar panels that go over the crops, and under climate change, some of the intensity is going to kill our crops. But if you put the right kind of solar panel over it, it can filter certain light through that's optimal for the crops, and then take the other spectrum to generate power. So we're talking about a pilot project there where we bring in 4-H with Youth Tour to do an ag and solar voltaic project at Anza and develop a business model that can scale nationally. So like that's an example of one kind of partnership that you can do in this space. There's so many other creative things to do as well. I think about a lot of our communities have fly-by-night contractors that are coming in and promising to put solar in your home and save, retirees X amount of dollars. My mom gets this all the time. And that would be a really cool project for extension to work on with co-ops to vet those vendors that come in. That would be one example I have. Or what if the electric co-ops themselves provided those particular services? That way, the electric co-op that's already providing power is helping you out with your rooftop solar along the way. So I don't really have a straight answer other than say there's a lot of projects that are out there. There's a lot of creativity we can have. We just need to get in the room with these electric cooperatives.
All right, we've got some good comments in the chat. So if you haven't looked recently, be sure and check that out. Thank you, Associate Professor Taylor, for joining us today and for your excellent insight. And we will go ahead and give you a couple minutes back to the hour. Thanks everybody for joining today.
Thanks, everybody.